Austrian economics refers to a school of economic thought that arose out of Vienna during the late 19th, early 20th century. Some of the key figures in this movement were von Berg, Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises. And the term Austrian economics was sort of a derogatory label applied to the school by their rivals, the German historical school, led by Gustav Müller. So they were a school of thought, economic school of thought, just like the Keynesians or classical economists, neoclassical, public choice, the physiocrats, or the modern monetary theorists. Basically, a group of people that share sort of the same basic principles, same sort of core ideas or axioms, and they sort of build on and promote each other's work. The Austrian school evolved out of what's known as the classical school of economics. So Ricardo, Smith, Cantillon, Turgot. So a lot of people during the 18th, 19th, 17th century that started puzzling about economic concepts and coming up with answers to some of these questions, developing models like supply and demand, the labor theory of value that were sort of the first steps towards building the body of economic doctrine or thought. So there's a number of contributions of the Austrian school to modern economic science, building upon the foundation uh, of Ricardo and others. And one of the things that the Austrian school did was they advanced the Austrian theory of the trade cycle or the business cycle. And and Mises built the theory of the trade cycle. He sort of borrowed from a few ideas, a few economists. So he took Wixell's theory of the pure rate of interest or the natural rate of interest, and then he integrated it with the Mengerian Bombewerk theory of capital, and he integrated that with Hume's theory of monetary policy that supply of money influenced the general price level. So the Austrian theory of the business cycle starts with the expansion of the money supply. Either like you could print money, actually physically print it, or create it electronically, or you can extend credit. So the reason why central banking sort of got started in the first place was because governments needed money to fund wars. So they would they, they would give a monopoly on the creation of banknotes to the central bank, and then the central bank would basically create money out of thin air, lend it to the government. The government would use that to pay for their wars and whatever sort of bills they had. And if the bank got in trouble because their notes were called upon for redemption in specie gold, then the king would sort of intervene and say, "Oh yeah, we'll get to that later," because back in the day, back in like the 19th, 18th century, the whole system of money was a lot different. Basically, gold was money, and if you had like banknotes, they would be redeemable for gold because it was just more convenient. So they're like sort of a paper money that represented gold issued by private banks or going further back, goldsmiths. And of course, what every bank wanted to do was lend out more than they had, so-called fractional reserve banking, where you've got $1 million in gold, but you lend out $5 million or $10 million in banknotes, collateralized at interest, and then you just hope that you collect the loan before the notes are called upon for redemption. But that doesn't really work because uh, what happens is, you lend out the money to businesses collateralized by their inventory or their land or whatever, and then they spend it, and these banknotes go to another bank. Of course, the other bank does not want the notes; they want the gold, so they call upon the first bank for redemption. And if the first bank can't redeem all their banknotes, then they're bankrupt. Big problem. But if you have the government, the king or the republic, the president, whoever, state government on your side, then they can allow you to suspend specie payment. This happened a number of times throughout history, where the bank is still allowed to collect on their loans, but they didn't have to pay out the depositors. This happened after the War of 1812. The bank was borrowing from these sort of wildcat banks that were using fractional reserves. They only had 30% gold to notes that they had lent out to the government. Government's using them to buy goods in New England, manufactured goods for the war effort, and the New England banks call upon the other banks for redemption, and they can't pay up. But then the government said, "Oh, it's okay." So so the business cycle starts with printing money, credit expansion, and for example, so what happens is, for example, in the 1920s, after the Federal Reserve was established in America, the banks were able to engage in expansionary credit because there was a big change. The banknotes were no longer redeemable for gold, they were redeemable for Federal Reserve notes. The Federal Reserve notes were redeemable for gold, so it was like a gold standard. However, they were seldom called upon for redemption. So because of this, the banks were able to lend out money they didn't have, just sort of create the money out of thin air, lend it out, and then if any one bank got called upon too much for redemption, the Federal Reserve would stand by. That's the whole idea, lender of last resort. Keep the whole house of cards afloat. Keep the whole house of cards from crumbling. So the private banks were able to do this during the 1920s. There were some changes to reserve. There were some changes, some policy changes that facilitated this. But essentially, what happened was they increased the money supply by about 28 billion, which was a large amount at the time. It was about 50% of the money supply over the course of the decade, just in expansionary loans to businesses. And so what this did was it created a huge demand uh, for expansion, for business expansion, right? Because all this new money was created and then lent out to these businesses. They're all using it to expand, and so it was diverting sort of a lot of resources towards business expansion, towards the production of higher order goods, or what are called capital goods. So usually, from the perspective of the consumer, you're really just focused on consumer goods, a television, a groceries you buy, furniture, whatever, stuff that you buy and consume. But of course, there's several stages along the way um, before you get consumer goods, right? Like, so the first stage might be logging. the wood that's used to build stuff. And then those logs get sent somewhere to be turned into 2x4s, you know, or whatever they do with wood to make it to build furniture out of it. So there's several steps along the way. So the economy is not just about producing consumer goods, it's also about producing stuff so that you can produce consumer goods. Building factories so that the factories can produce screws or widgets or whatever factories produce. And even before you can build the factory, somebody's got to build the tools that you use to build the factory. Somebody's got to process those raw materials. And before you can process the raw materials, somebody's going to build the stuff you use to process those raw materials, right? So there's higher order goods. It's like those Russian nesting dolls, it's just higher order goods all the way down. So all this money was being created. It's a lot of money, you know. 50% of the total money supply was these loans that were backed by very minimal deposits. So all this money bid away resources. And though CPI, Consumer Price Index, was relatively stable during this time period, in fact, that was the explicit mandate of the Fed at the time, uh, there's other prices in an economy aside from CPI. So uh, other prices were going up. The wages of workers in capital goods industries, raw material, that sort of stuff, because that was really highly in demand. There was all these people with dollars trying to buy that, so that pushes the price up gradually. As sellers of that start running out, they up the price a little bit, and supply and demand. If demand increases and supply stays the same or decreases, because things are getting sold out, whatever. So there is a reallocation, an allocation, or a misallocation of resources towards these industries, because the reason why resources were going there was because the loans were being extended so businesses could expand, and because the banks were no longer constrained by their reserves, the supply of loanable funds, um, in nominal terms, increased substantially, and in real terms as well. I mean, imagine, in a prior situation, you're constrained to lending out only real savings, okay? And then you go from that to a fractional reserve situation where you can lend out, 90% more than you have, or you keep your, okay, you have your $1 million in gold, okay? You keep that in reserve and you lend out 9 million in paper money, right? And now you got that 9-to-1 reserve ratio required by law. So there's huge amounts of loanable funds available, were not previously available. And this pushes down the rate of interest and leads to really overinvestment in capital goods industries. You see, the interest rate is determined by the amount of loanable funds versus the demand to borrow money. So artificially low interest rates, because of the credit expansion, mimic a situation of increased consumer savings, length and time preference. I mean, if you think about it, like every dollar in the economy is basically an entitlement to some amount of production. Okay. So all this money was going into the hands of businesses, and all the production was being shifted basically not all the production, but production was being shifted towards capital goods industries, towards the production of higher order goods. Now, this is problematic because the shift wasn't representative of consumer demand. See, in the market economy, consumer demand is like the word of God, okay, or the word of the Pharaoh during Egypt. It's absolute. Businesses have to produce what people want to buy. There's nothing they can do about that. And if they don't, then it's a big problem, because you're spending all this money to create the stuff and nobody's buying it. And sucks to be you. It's a skill issue, but so you don't want to do that. So consumer demand hadn't changed during this whole time period. The loans were being extended to the businesses, but consumer preference was the same. And so this is really leading to overinvestment or malinvestment in capital goods industries. People, unfortunately, were just not as farsighted or as low time preference as would be uh, to justify all this production of higher order goods. They want the lower order goods. They want stuff now. They want stuff yesterday. It's what have you done for me lately? We're as a people, as a species, we're very short sighted. We're focused on what's on our dinner plate. Most of us. Some people are very very far sighted in the future. They love to save. They don't like to spend. Most of us, it's that money is burning a hole in my pocket, right? So what happened eventually was the malinvestments in capital goods industries were liquidated. And that's the crash, the stock market crash. There's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of businesses realizing they made a mistake and they're trying to sell, so it's problematic. Prices are going down, and that's the bust. And the bust is actually, the depression is actually the healthy phase of the business cycle, because factors of production are getting realigned back on track with consumer demand, and the economy is sort of righting itself. It was misled. The economy was misled. It was going in the wrong direction, and it sucks when you realize that. When you realize, oh, I've been going in the wrong direction for the last 20 minutes. I'm a mile out of my way now. I got to turn around. Okay. And that sucks. But the solution is not to keep going in the other way. The solution is to turn around. You got to realize, we're going in the wrong direction. Because the longer you go in the wrong direction, the farther back you're going to have to go when you turn around. And better to just go in the right direction in the first place. But yeah, that's essentially the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, the business cycle. They print money, create money. It leads to economic dislocation, malinvestment, and then it's liquidated. And there's sort of like a corollary to this, because like that whole liquidation process, it's not very long lasting. Usually recessions only last 6 months to a year. But if the correction is not allowed to take place, if you get the government intervening, and especially keeping wages too high, then this can lead to a long recession or depression. Anyway, I'm going to move on because a lot of other contributions to the Austrian school, although the business cycle theory is very important. And I'm going to move on and talk about praxeology. Okay. So Mises, who was, one of the top guys, the Austrian school, a brilliant polymath, and you got to read his work. Incredible mind, this guy, and a very interesting life story. He was He was born in Austria, and at a time when everybody in the country was either communist or fascist, all the intellectuals, that was the dominant ideology of the time, central planning. Mises was the last knight of liberalism. He was saying, no, we got to go free market, we got to go capitalism, and don't print money, because that's what happened in Germany in during the Weimar Republic. So after World War One, these guys got elected, and they were basically social democrats. They wanted to spend a lot of money, and they ended up printing a lot of money, and it caused just devastating hyperinflation, the collapse of the German economy, and oh yeah, contributed to the rise of the Nazi Party. Although, I mean, who knows? The Nazis might have taken power either way, or the communists. I mean, that was the way things were headed anyway. But it certainly helped, when you have just absolute economic chaos and the middle class is wiped out. I mean, that is people want to turn to somebody who's got some easy answers, blame it all on specific ethnic group or whatever. So so Mises was actually uh, it wasn't safe for him in Germany. He was highly critical of central planning, which was the whole fascist system, central planning. So he had to flee, fled to Switzerland. He wasn't safe there. Fled to the United States, where he labored in obscurity, despite being one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. You know, just an absolute genius with with un, unprecedented command of economics and sociology, and just so well read and brilliant, and I mean, just a tremendous scholar who's completely ignored by academia, and all these grossly inferior people who are intellectuals, Marxists, were being given, prestigious teaching posts, and he's just there laboring in obscurity. The the college wouldn't even pay his salary. It was up to some industrialist, to finance him. And really, really an incredible figure, Mises. And you got to read his work. I mean, just just phenomenal. Uh, he wrote Human Action, which is this vast treatise on economics. Really captures the whole thing. Other books, Theory and History, Liberalism, Socialism. I mean, he wrote, he produced so much, and work of such substantial quality. So another contribution of the Austrian school of Mises was this idea that economics is not a science in itself, in its own right, but rather a subset of praxeology, the science of human action. And then both economics and history and economic history, these are all just sort of branches of praxeology. And and although mainstream economics doesn't really acknowledge Mises, um, there is still a strong focus in modern economics on consumer behavior, human action, basically. So it's sort of made its way in there a little bit. Um, and part of the whole idea behind praxeology is the Misesian methodology. So so Mises argued that praxeology, that economics, uh, was a deductive science. That you start with this synthetic analytic judgment. Man acts. So, what is a synthetic analytic judgment? It's it's basically a statement that we know to be true, that's undeniably true, axiomatically true. Okay, um, and man acts. That is a statement which is undeniably true. You can't even possibly attempt to deny it because by denying it, you have to act. Denying it by denying it, you're proving it. Man acts, and it seems like a trivial statement, right? Man acts. It's just two words, two simple words. But actually, there's a tremendous wealth of information in those two words. Man describes everything we know about humanity, the species, quite a lot. We are the accumulation of 5 billion years of evolution. Okay, we are complex phenomena, and action as well is complex phenomena. What is action? Action is purposeful behavior intent upon bringing a result. So you conceive of something, for example, I'm thirsty, and and you think, well, how can I sate my thirst, right? I can stand up, walk into the kitchen, pour myself a glass of water, drink it, my thirst is gone. Okay, I have substituted an inferior state of affairs for a superior state of affairs. Human action. So that's so. So this is very important because the other way of doing things is logical positivism, which is basically what people think the scientific method is. Um, like like you do experiments and then you try to judge from those experiments. You try to infer some laws from those experiments, or you look at some statistical data. You say, oh, okay, the statistical data says that, so I'm going to infer some economic law from the statistical data. And there's so many statistics and so much data, often conflicting, that you can infer almost anything from it, which is great if you're an ideologue and you're just trying to prove some specific point you've already determined if you're right. But if you're a scientist or a philosopher, if you're searching for truth, very problematic. Because if you can infer anything from data, and you can, people do it all the time, then you're not really any closer to the truth. You're just confirming your biases. And so that's why the best methodology for economics is to deduce economic laws from the action axiom and then use those economic laws to explain economic phenomena. And people say that Austrian economists don't use empirical data. That's untrue. Uh, what they don't do is they don't infer economic laws from empirical data. They still use empirical data, um, but they use it to explain what's happening. They use economic theory as sort of guiding light in analyzing economic data that occurred. So why is this the right methodology? Well, I'll tell you right now why. Just look at the minimum wage debate. It's very clear that the minimum wage prohibits low-skilled workers from entering the workplace. And you can see this empirically as well. You don't have to just take my Ipsy Dixit pronouncement, but you can look at the rise in teenage unemployment, that's correlated with increase in the minimum wage. Teenagers being a surrogate for low skilled workers in general. But it's best understood logically. So everyone has a skill set, a marketable skill set, and the value of that skill set is essentially their wage. Depends on how competitive the marketplace is, uh, but and it depends on how many other people are selling their labor, willing to sell their labor, to do the same thing or to accomplish the same sort of thing. Actually, workers are really sort of in what economists call a state of monopolistic competition, which is sort of like a nonsense term, but basically they're heterogeneous. So every worker is very different from every other worker, even those that do the same job and get paid the same salary, because there's so many there's like an unlimited amount of variables that affect the way that you do work. Um, so, for example, personal hygiene, okay, physical fitness, um, geniality, are you really pleasant? Person skills, so there's all these soft skills in the background that are going to vary from person to person, and you could go on forever. You know, do you have a car? Do you live nearby? Do you have a busy social life? These are all different things that could make you more productive or more desirable, less desirable for your employer. There could be literally hundreds or thousands of these, and they don't all make a big difference, right? But the point is that every worker has a certain skill set that leads to their labor being worth a certain amount as determined by somebody's paying them or willing to pay them that price. So it might be $9 an hour, whatever, to wash dishes. Might be $40 an hour, senior programmer, whatever. Now, if you set the minimum wage above that worker's market rate for their labor, then they're not going to be able to find work, especially if it's like really high above. So if somebody's got a skill set worth $5 an hour, you set the minimum wage to $10 an hour, that person will not be employable. Whereas if there's no minimum wage, they will be employable. Somebody will be able to pay them $3, $2, $5. At some point they will find work. For basically anybody. Maybe not if you're like a quadriplegic or something, but I mean, even a paraplegic, even somebody who can't use their legs, can still work in a call center, right? And especially as the economy progresses, working from home, whatever. So it's very clear that the minimum wage does create unemployment. Logically, it's unassailable. You think through that. Unless everybody in the economy has a skill set above the minimum wage, it's going to create at least some unemployment. But it's now basically the dominant, maybe not dominant thought, but there's considerable debate over whether the minimum wage causes unemployment. It's because they're using the wrong methodology. They're trying to do experiments and trying to determine whether it causes uh, unemployment based on these experiments. So why is that a bad thing? Isn't that what science is all about? Doing experiments. How do I know I'm right? You know, the problem is the experiments aren't measuring what they claim to be measuring. For example, in a study that won the Nobel Prize, Card-Kruger in New Jersey, their method for testing whether or not the increase in the minimum wage caused unemployment was calling up fast food restaurants and seeing if they had fired anybody before and after the minimum wage. Well, that doesn't tell you if the minimum wage is causing unemployment. That tells you if they fired somebody at that restaurant. Okay, maybe that's one possible result of raising the minimum wage. But the minimum wage increase was modest, and it's kind of expensive to search for new replacements. And the economy was sort of going out of a recession at that time, and so wages should have been rising anyway. Like it's just it's basically impossible to find a good experiment. It's very difficult to find a good experiment to test these things. There's so many confounding variables. There's so much noise. The statistics themselves are unreliable. They're based on extrapolations and guesswork. This is not exact measurement. And uh, add to that, what you're studying is human behavior, human action, which people have agency of their own. So trying to say that any action is caused by any stimuli is itself extremely dubious. Um, there's influences, but ultimately, uh, human choices, people have agency. So human choices are the ultimate given. Human action is the ultimate given itself. You can't really reduce it down to anything beneath that. Going back to the fast food restaurant, um, like even if it would have been financially prudent to fire one of the employees, maybe the lowest productivity employee, the manager might not have done that. They might like the person, so they don't want to fire them. They're not acting strictly. They're not a homo economicus. They're not a strictly calculating machine, especially if they're a manager and not an owner. They don't even really care. I mean, they probably care. They want to do a good job, but they don't really care. It's not. It doesn't affect them. It's not their money, right? And it is their relationship with that person. So it's just economics is not really something that's cut and dried like that, where you can isolate variables. It's not like you can do the experiment in physics where you're dropping two different objects a different weight and you adjust for air friction and they follow the same speed. You can't really do that in economics. Certainly not when it comes to sort of learning about the science and trying to figure out what the rules are based on observations. That's not going to get you anywhere. So that was methodology and as well the sort of creation or taxonomy of praxeology. Another contribution of the Austrian school was subjective value theory. So prior to them, the dominant value theory was the labor value theory. Smith, being a good Calvinist, believed that all virtue came from work, and from this, Karl Marx sort of evolved the idea, that labor was responsible for the creation of all wealth. Um, so the Austrian argument is that value is subjective, that people will value the same thing differently. And this is, I think, pretty intuitive. If you're a meat eater, you're going to place a lot more value on a nice, juicy, medium rare steak than a vegan will. They want a salad or something, pizza without any cheese. What an abomination! Pizza without any cheese. I guess they have vegan cheese now. So, or if you're an artist, you're gonna place more value on art supplies than somebody who isn't an artist. They won't value them very much. They'll value them maybe for what they can trade them for. So people value things differently, and this is actually a very important concept in economics because it enables us to see that trades are almost always mutually beneficial, and this is an important evolution on Aristotelian thought that exchanges had to be of equal value, um, which doesn't really make sense. Why would you even trade? So People trade because they expect to benefit. If you have a lot of something, if you're a fisherman and you catch a lot of fish, more than you can eat, you don't have a refrigerator, they're going to go bad. You don't place that much value on your 20th fish. Certainly not nearly as much value as you did on your first or second that you got dinner tonight. And maybe the third and fourth you knew you could sell. But now you got 20. You don't value it as much. You want to sell it. You want to lower the price and sell it. Make sure you sell it before it goes bad. You get nothing out of it. Just rotten. So so value is subjective, and that's why people can trade. Both parties can benefit from trade. A worker, they exchange their labor, which they got nothing but time anyway, and they get money that they can use to buy food or shelter, stuff that's very valuable to them. They benefit. The employer, he benefits. He's got a lot of money, but he doesn't have enough hands or time to do all these things he's got to do for his business. So they both benefit. It's win-win. It's mutually beneficial. And virtually all exchanges are mutually beneficial because every individual is an expert in determining whether or not a trade benefits them. This is also very important because it's the bedrock foundation of the capitalist system, and why capitalism works so well is because everybody's working together harmoniously, making exchanges that benefit each other or not. So it's either you're working with other people or you're just not interacting with them. But it's all the interactions are win-win, both parties benefiting, expecting to benefit. They're almost always right. The exception, maybe you're a child, you're dumb, dumb kid. You'll trade all your money for magic cards, when you should put it in the bank account or whatever. That's what I did when I was a child. That's how I spent whatever money I would get. Or you don't really have that much experience when you're a child in determining whether a trader will benefit you or not. But as you get older, you've got literally your entire life you've spent, trying to make decisions that benefit you, and uh, you're also the only person that's aware of your own personal ends and goals, and what means you have to achieve them. So value is subjective, and there's some important conclusions. And this is mainstream economic dogma now. I don't think there's any other competing theories of value aside from Marxists, of course, still clinging stubbornly to the labor theory of value. They argue capital is nothing but frozen labor. It's very poetic, much a hooey. And then the marginal revolution, which we sort of touched on with the fish, diminishing marginal utility. Yeah, so that's, I guess, a brief overview of the Austrian School of Economics. We could go into a lot more depth, Rothbard and Hoppe, Di Lorenzo, Jesus, De Soto. And maybe we will another day, but I just wanted to give you sort of a brief overview of the Austrian School, their contributions to economic theory.